All right, so I'm recording here. So welcome to curriculum instruction, intro to curriculum instruction for the 10 o'clock hour on, what is today? April 28th. All my days are starting to kind of blend together on me, but April 28th, 10 a.m. Glad to see you guys today. This will be our last face-to-face Zoom as far as like class time. I will be here from 10 to 11 on Thursday as an office hour. If you have any questions about your lesson planning, things along those lines. The plan for today, basically what we're going to do, I'm going to start off by giving you some tips and pointers about things that I noticed for those that turned in their lesson plans a little early. Most of that looked really good, but there's some things that I'll ask you to work on as you're kind of moving forward. Then I'll let you ask any questions you have about that. Then we're going to go into talking about accommodations and modifications. The reasons behind those things, and then how you can incorporate those into your lesson plans. And then we'll ask and answer questions again after that, and then we'll be out of here. That's the general plan for the day. So as we get started, just some things I noticed for those who turned in their lesson plans preliminarily. Understanding that some of you who turned them in weren't quite done, and that's fine. So, first tip, finish it out and be fine. Second thing though, remember on like your objectives. Some of you put an awful lot of objectives on there. And remember that mostly, your lesson plans are going to be 45 minutes. If you're a secondary person, they may last less than that if you're an elementary person, depending on the subject matter that you're teaching. So like 3 to 4 objectives is probably what you would want to have in a lesson plan format for 45 minutes. And even that might be too many, depending on what you're trying to teach and when. If you get more than that, you're almost getting into kind of unit plan territory. And it's good to have objectives for everything you want to accomplish in the unit, but be aware that in a daily lesson plan, you're probably not going to get to all of those objectives that you have for your unit. So concentrate on 3 or 4 and see if you can kind of build your activities around that. The other thing I would say is, and I'm sure this is probably because you just weren't done yet for the most part, but don't forget that the activities that you do in your plan, you need to connect those to research-based instructional strategies. So if you're going to do a stand-up, hand-up, pair-up in your lesson plan as an activity, remember that somewhere in parentheses after that activity is listed, that's connected to cooperative learning according to Marzano. Now, obviously, you don't do that in your real lesson plans. That's just not something that you'll do. But to demonstrate that you understand how those strategies play into what we're asking you to do, we've asked you to do that on your plan. So don't forget to do that as well, okay? Do you guys have any questions about your lesson plans as you have turned them in now? I think that everybody that turned them in preliminarily, I looked at, most, like I said, you've done really well. I just offered some little pieces of feedback here and there. Any big questions that you've got?
I have a question.
Okay.
So I started using Hunters or that template,
Yes.
and so I was looking at the Missouri standards, and I kind of started doing like the objectives and the I-CAN statements.
Mhm.
So on the Missouri standards, there's like the grade level expectation, and then like A, B, C, D, and there's like all the different things that you have to do. So could I split that up so that it's, and like, are each of those A, B, C, D, would that be considered like the objective? Like each one of those?
Um, Most likely,
Or
yes. And I would have to see the actual, like the GLE itself, but most of those you can probably, as you break them down, they'll become objectives. And it also depends. You're talking about specifically the GLEs, like the grade level expectations in each of those standards. Probably you could break each of those down as an objective. Um, I know I remember looking at yours, and I think that's basically what you did, and that's okay. But remember that you're probably only going to address 3 or 4 of those per lesson plan too.
okay, so I don't have to do like all A, B, C, D, F, G, like H. Like I could split it up to make it so that it was like the 40-minute
Oh
time.
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay,
So
okay.
sometimes the GLEs, depending upon the grade level expectation, if it breaks down into multiple objectives, you can't teach all those in one day. That's going to have to be a multiple day kind of thing.
Right, right.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay,
Yep. That's a great question. Thank you for asking that.
thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? All right. Well, let's kind of get into it then. going to share my screen with you. First, I'll share just the course website screen here. All the stuff that I'm using today is going to come from the week 6 module, I think. Let me just make sure that's true. Yeah, okay, so we're going to be looking at this a PowerPoint. It's accommodations and modifications. That's where you find it here in the week 6 module. And then we're also going to be looking at various students for differentiation. And there's a document that lists 5 different students that you're going to pick one of those to differentiate for in your plan. So those are the 2 documents we're going to take a look at today. And as we move into that PowerPoint, I'll just give you kind of a rundown of what accommodations and modifications are. And if you have questions at any time, please do ask. If I'm not saying something correctly or saying it to your understanding, just let me know, and we'll try different tact. So some of you mentioned that you started the modified Hunter plan. So if you're looking at the Hunter plan, on the left side is the regular lesson that you're designing. Then on the right side, there's space for accommodations and modifications for students as you go through. If you're using the 5E plan, the space for accommodations and modifications, I think, is on the top of the document. In the other templates that we're using, I honestly don't know them well enough to know where the space is, and there may not be a specific space, but understand that you're on the hook for at least one accommodation or modification on whichever plan that you use, okay? And as I said, I have a document that's got 5 students that list their situations, and you can pick and choose of those students and accommodate or modify for that student as necessary. But you are on the hook for that no matter which plan you use, even if the plan doesn't have a specific spot for accommodations and modifications. So the first thing we need to understand about accommodations and modifications is it essentially is adjustments that we make as teachers to help students learn to their best ability, okay? So you might have, you can kind of read the bottom part of this slide if you want to. You might have students that have various disabilities, learning or physical. Students who are gifted, we don't often think about that, but sometimes we do have to modify or accommodate for students who are gifted. English language learner students, those who don't speak English as their first language. Students with other special needs that are not included under special education. You may have students in your class that fall under what are called 504 plans, meaning that either temporarily or permanently they've become disabled in some way, whether it's they've broken an arm or a leg, or they've developed a condition where they're gradually losing sight. Those are all things that you need to accommodate or modify for in the framework of your classroom so that students can fully participate in the instruction that you give. And ultimately, that's your goal as a teacher, is to be inclusive of everybody that's in your classroom as much as you possibly can be. And so you kind of have to begin with this assumption, and that's all students can learn. And it's repeated so often that it kind of becomes cliche, but there are teachers out there that don't necessarily believe it. And so I need you as a teacher to understand and believe this, that all students can learn. They may not learn in the same way. They may not learn at the same rate. They may not learn the exact same stuff that every other student learns. They may not learn as many things, but all students can learn, and they deserve to be treated like that in the framework of your classroom. And so that allows us to ask these questions, which I kind of just referred to. Do all students learn equally? The answer is no, they probably don't. Do all students learn in the same way? They absolutely do not. One of the most, I don't know if I want to say, one of the biggest surprises for me as a first-year teacher was that my students in my classroom did not learn in the same manner that I did, which was an interesting time for me because I taught in the way that I learned. So when I come up as a student, I love to take notes, love to write them down, love to rewrite them later at home, had multiple pens of different colors and highlighters, and I did all that stuff. I highlighted and all, and it was a shock to me that sometimes students didn't process information in that exact same way. And it caused me eventually to have to completely change my teaching style, because all I had in my bag when I went into my classroom that first year was that one trick, right? So the earlier that you understand that students don't learn in the same way, the better off you'll be when it comes into your when you come into your own classroom. And especially when it comes to modifying and accommodating for students, which quite frankly, I was pretty terrible at in those first years that I taught. So the object is, multifold, but one of them is to be better than me when you walk into your classroom for the first time. Do you give all of your students an equal opportunity to learn? Um, Not do you give them the same thing so they can learn from them? Do you give them an equal opportunity to learn in your classroom? And there's a subtle difference there. Lots of things account for learning differences. If you're an elementary teacher in particular, developmental readiness will come into play for you. Quite honestly, there are sometimes students that come into your classroom that just aren't ready physically, emotionally, mentally to learn in the way that you most often teach. And so you have to modify or accommodate for that. Some students have experiential background differences from each other. I mean, everybody has a different background when it gets right down to it, but some come from radically different backgrounds. They've had different experiences in terms of their home life. In some cases, there may be a lot of transience among students, and it's really difficult to pick up and learn things if you're constantly moving, house to house, apartment to apartment, in some cases, school to school. Cultural differences account for that. Family and values, individual learning styles. I kind of mentioned that. I was shocked to notice that my students didn't learn the same way that I did, and that affected the way that I taught. And also disabilities. Some students have intellectual or developmental disabilities. Some students have learning disabilities. Some of them have physical disabilities that prevent them from learning in the way that you teach. So again, you must adjust and accommodate and modify as we go through. And you do that by making appropriate instructional or environmental accommodations and modifications. Let's see. Skipping a few slides here. I think the one thing I would say about this is to realize that one size fits all idea of education doesn't work for everybody. And you can, in the lesson plan that you create, you will probably capture most of your students in how they learn. But there are always those in your classroom that won't be fully on board with what you're teaching, and those are the students that you need to watch for and modify for and accommodate for as you notice and as you need. Okay, so I've thrown around accommodations and modifications, and I need you to know that there's a difference between those two things, okay? An accommodation is any change that you make so that you can deliver information in such a way, or students can process information in a way that makes it level the playing field. As far as an accommodation goes, you do not adjust the complexity of your assignment at all. So for instance, if you're dwelling in Bloom's taxonomy and you decide you want your students to analyze a particular event that happened in an historical context, an accommodation would mean that you don't adjust that at all. No matter what you do to accommodate the student, they're still going to do that analysis. So if a student by chance, I don't know, was just diagnosed with a condition, as I maybe mentioned earlier, that is the student's kind of losing their sight. I had that happen in my classroom, actually, that a student was diagnosed with a condition that over time she would lose more and more eyesight. And so an accommodation you can make for that student is to move her to closer to the front of the classroom so she can see the projections on the screen, see the board better. Another accommodation you could do for her is to give her notes beforehand that actually are in large type so that she can read them. You might put a buddy with that student so that if she's not able to see something, the student can clarify what's being said or what's being written down on the board. Those are accommodations. You're not adjusting the assignment itself. She's still going to have to do the analysis that everybody else does, but there are things that you can do to accommodate the idea that she's losing her sight. Okay, that's one example. A modification is an alteration that's made when a student is not able to participate fully in general instruction or testing. Okay, so for instance, if again, we go back to this idea that you want students to analyze a particular historical event and the student has an intellectual disability that prevents or that means that student's not going to be able to do that analysis in the way that you want, well, then you might take that out of that higher order thinking from Bloom's, and you might move it into the student is not going to analyze the stuff, but the student's going to create a timeline that orders the events in chronological order. okay? And so that's an adjustment of the complexity level of the assignment. And that's called a modification. That's the difference between a modification and an accommodation. Okay, I just threw an awful lot at you, and we've got more to go, but any questions about what we've said so far in terms of accommodations or modifications, the reasons behind it? Okay, resharing. And I guess the other thing I would say about this too is I mentioned the 504 plan. Some of you have heard of individualized education plans or IEPs. Not only are those moral documents, I mean, if you have a student that is bound by that document, that 504 plan or that IEP, I mean, morally and ethically, you have an obligation as a teacher to meet the conditions that that document sends out to you. But there's also a legal obligation that you have as well. And so if the moral or ethical obligation doesn't sway you, hopefully it does, but if it doesn't, you're still on the hook for it legally. And so if you are deliberately not, or even in some cases not deliberate, if you're just not implementing those accommodations or modifications as they're written, that comes back on you as a teacher. Okay, it comes back on you, and it'll come back on your school district too. And if the school district has to address those issues, then the potential for you being a teacher in the district decreases, right? So you're on the hook for these things no matter what. So we might as well do them, although morally and ethically we should be on the hook for them anyway. All right. I'm going to throw this slide out here. I don't fully agree with it, but it lets me talk about the process of you writing your lesson plans. This slide says that accommodations and modifications are considered and made in the planning process rather than at the end as add-ons. But I would say to that in some ways that it's kind of up to you and how you plan things out. For me, I was always a big fan of the Hunter plan, the Madeline Hunter style plan. And most of the time I would actually do the full lesson plan on the left-hand side of that document. Then I would go back and think about the students that might need to be accommodated for and modified for, and then I would write my accommodations in on the right-hand side. So if I'm reading this right, I'm essentially doing, I did most of the time what they say not to do, but it worked for me, I think. And so I would just say, think about your planning and how you want to write your plan. If it works for you in the midst of your planning to write those accommodations in, so be it. If it works for you at the end to go back through and consider how to accommodate what you've written, I think that's probably okay as well. Again, the only thing that you really can't do morally, ethically, or legally is not do the accommodations, okay? So however you choose to do it, I think that's probably okay. And you can look at some different modification strategies here toward the end of this PowerPoint. Determine teacher control elements. What is it that you as a teacher can maneuver or fix for those students to make it easier for them? One of those things you can do in terms of information presentation, you can give students outline notes, you can give them lecture notes ahead of time. We talked about visual aids already in the case of that one student that I had. Read written directions aloud or repeat or paraphrase. Now this is an accommodation that can be written into the IEP that they're allowed to do those things, but sometimes on the standardized tests like the state testing, you can't necessarily do those things. So it's a kind of a weird deal in that way. You can give students fewer items per page, provide copies rather than have the student copy from the board or the book. All of those things are different accommodations or modifications you can do. Large print, we kind of talked about that. Time adjustment. If a student is a real, has an issue with feeling pressured from the time that's allotted for taking a test, well, it's okay for you as a teacher to say, everybody, we got 45 minutes in class. If you need some extra time, that's quite all right. You can modify the time that you can take tests. You can modify or accommodate for extended time on assignments as well. The due date for this assignment is May 1st, but Timmy's due date is May 3rd. That gives Timmy a little extra time. There's nothing wrong with doing things like that. A good rule of thumb on that is fair is not always equal. To be fair for all students means that on occasion there are accommodations or modifications that you make. Student response methods, as far as accommodations or modifications go, you can allow students to tape record what you're saying in class so they can go back and look at it later. Rather than writing anything on a test, they can actually record their response. Whoever did this PowerPoint is revealing their age. I don't think we really tape record anything anymore, but we can record those responses rather than write. Some students have in their IEP plans or 504 plans that they can actually dictate to a person who writes their stuff down as opposed to writing it themselves. Again, we've talked about adjusting lengths of assignments, providing study guides. That's an accommodation that you can make. Marking correct answers and not mistakes. I mean, that's an accommodation that you can make, and then the student has to go back and figure out what he or she did wrong in the framework of the mistakes and not necessarily worry about the correct answers anymore. All those things that you can do are things that you can do to accommodate or modify individual assignments or assignments or activities for groups of people. The John F. Kennedy quote to kind of sum this up: all of us do not have equal talent, but all of us should have an equal opportunity to develop our talents, and that's your job as a teacher. Modify and accommodate as necessary so that all of your students feel like they have a chance to learn in your classroom. Okay, questions about any of that? Okay, so again, you're on the hook for modification or accommodation for one student, and let me show you what that looks like. So I showed you where to find it. It's week 6 module. When you open the document that talks about students for accommodation, or let me actually just share that part again. What's it say? Yeah, students for differentiation. So when you open that, you'll find a Word document that you can download, or you can look at it like this, if it pops up. There are 5 students here. Student A has both a learning disability and giftedness. Student B has a learning disability in reading and written language. Student C is moderately mentally retarded and has immature social skills. Student D just moved here from India, and so is an English language learner, one would suspect. Oh, I'm sorry, that's wrong. He speaks fluent English and is very social. And student E is a child in situational poverty. And so for some of these students, you're going to have to go back to what you learned in the ecology class or the developmental class and kind of think about how you would accommodate or modify for them.
So is that a separate assignment than the lesson plan, or does that go with the lesson
You just
plan?
include that stuff in the lesson plan. If you're
Okay,
doing the
so
Hunter
each
plan,
student added to the lesson plan, all of them?
just pick one.
Just one, okay.
Just pick one.
Sorry.
Yep, pick
Okay.
one. Yep, just pick one. You pick whichever one you want. But here's the thing. Please do identify the student that you pick on the plan somewhere. Just say, I'm modifying for student A or accommodating for student A or whatever,
Okay.
so that I can kind of, as I look through, and if you're talking about the student from India who's fluent in English, but you are providing extra help in his language acquisition skills, that's not the right modification, right? So so just let me know so I can
Okay.
provide you with some feedback. But just one, don't do them all. Or I guess you know what, do what you want, but you got to do at least one. There we go. So other questions? That's a good question, Faith. Other questions? Okay.
Only one.
Yeah, I'm sure that more people have that question, but what else to say? If how do I want to phrase? So the lesson plan is due on May 1st, which is Friday. I think it's Friday. But May 1st is not necessarily the last day of the semester. So I'm making them do May 1st so that during finals week, if you need to adjust anything in your plan, you'll still have time to do that. Okay. So even if you turn it in May 1st and it's not necessarily up to par, you still got time. And that's been my promise to you throughout is, just work with me and I'll work with you and we'll get you through the semester together. Some of you, and I don't know, off the top of my head, I don't know who it is, but some of you still haven't addressed your issues with competencies 1 through 4. So just go back and make sure that if you had feedback from me that said to adjust or change things, please go back and make sure that you've done that. Again, this is Tuesday, we've got still almost 2 weeks left before I have to report final grades, but we need to make sure that we're kind of nipping that stuff in the bud so that it doesn't come back right on the last day or so to bite us. Okay, so that's my advice. Can't make you do anything, but I'll ask you to do that, and I promise you that as you do those things, I will work with you. All right, I'm going to stop the recording.